Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer. Today we're talking about local ordinances, why they're so important, and implications for advancing clean energy solutions. And of course, we'll cover what you can do. I'm sitting down with Federico Holm, a research scientist at the Center for Progressive Reform. CPR provides expertise on state and federal legislative and agency policy. I work with them a lot, and they're an important partner in creating smart strategies and solutions to advance and defend climate justice. I asked Fede to talk with us about his work on the challenges local communities are facing in building clean energy solutions, in particular, how local ordinances are cropping up to make a just transition more difficult. He recently released an analysis of existing restrictions that limit our ability to provide renewable energy. His study provides data and interactive maps for people to explore their local communities. The report updates their Communities Left Behind project. Fede's research finds that the pathway to a just transition is growing steeper, and we want to find out what we can do about it. Welcome, Fede, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Fede, you earned your Ph.D. in Environment and Natural Resources from The Ohio State University. You describe your degree and the program in which you studied as interdisciplinary. So why does this approach position you to take on complex challenges that we're facing?
Because every big challenge that we are trying to solve as a society is basically a collection of subsystems that interact with each other. And every action that humans take has an impact on the environment. Sometimes it's very close, sometimes a little bit further away, but it always has an impact. And we're always constrained by our natural environment, no matter how developed the area where we live is. It doesn't matter if we're in the middle of Manhattan or if we are in a tiny, small rural town in the Cascades. The natural environment still shapes us. So that's why I think interdisciplinarity is the key.
Yeah. So all of that makes sense to us. Those of us who work on climate justice, we definitely think about these questions and these challenges in an interdisciplinary way. So great to see that happening in academia. So after you graduated, you had this choice. You could have gone on to work in academia. You chose to work in the nonprofit. So for maybe those listeners out there that are in the middle of that decision, why'd you decide the nonprofit side of things?
I have talked about this in many different places because it's not the norm. I think for those who are pursuing PhDs in the US, the pathway for which we are trained is very academic focused. I did 2 postdocs after my PhD, and I was thinking about going into academia. But also, I think academia in the US really needs to break this deeply ingrained idea that the only way to have a successful professional life is by being a researcher at an R1 university. And when it came the time for me to really search for something long-term, I also wanted to balance other things that were super important for me. So I wanted to balance my personal life. I wanted to balance the possibility to be close to my partner. We had been doing long distance for years. So it all came together. I love what I do, and I have the possibility to do rigorous scientific work much more closer to the people who hopefully are using it, which is something I probably wouldn't have had at a university.
Definitely. Well, we are so grateful that you're in this space with us and that you're bringing all your training and your intellect to this work. It's definitely an important moment to have a lot of great thinkers trying to figure out where we go from here. So today we're going to be talking about local ordinances. It's another way of saying laws passed the city, county level, municipal level. And so, Fede, you've been spending some time looking at city ordinances, in particular around clean energy investments. So why is looking at this so important?
Well, the short answer is because everything must be built somewhere. And that seems very basic and very obvious. But because everything has to be somewhere, everything must be built somewhere, it is important that we understand how that somewhere is organized. And that is the role of local ordinances. So local ordinances regulate how development happens in and around towns, municipalities, or counties. And it happens to be so that when it comes to the clean energy transition, private lands lands owned by private landowners are excellent candidates for clean energy development in a way that also allows to bridge the gap between infrastructure development and direct benefits to communities. And since so much of the land that is in the hands of private landowners are really good candidates for this type of development, think extensive monocrop agriculture, your soys and corns and wheats and whatnot. Because of these are primarily in private hands, understanding how towns and counties decide where to build different things, it's really important. And the last thing is that moving forward, because these rural landowners and communities will have so much, will host a significant portion of wind, solar, and transmission, we need to understand the siting processes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you began this study in 2023, correct? 24. You recently updated that research. So when you first started in, it's, obviously the world has changed so much. I think your first paper, it was in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act, all the investments that were coming down locally. You've updated it here in 2026. Things are very, very different. So when you looked at it initially, what did you find?
What we found in 2023 is what we did is take the existence of local restrictions to building clean energy, socio-economic indicators, and energy burden data, and combine them into a model to rank counties based on how at risk they were on missing out on the clean energy transition. And what we found is that many of the counties, about a third of them, with the highest risk of missing out on the clean energy transition, that is, areas of the country with high restrictions to building clean energy, also represents part of the country that have been hit particularly hard by economic decline in recent decades. That is, areas that have experienced high unemployment and poverty rates compared to urban areas, and also that have been hollowed out by the phase out of some of the most polluting fossil fuel economic activities.
So given that you're seeing a relationship between rural communities or communities rather that have restrictions and a relationship to more economic and socioeconomic burdens or challenges, did you come to a conclusion about why that might be the case, why there's a relationship?
We did not, and we did not hypothesize on any relationship. What we wanted to do was to showcase that these areas exist and are more common than many people think, because the problem that we saw was that in this framing of ordinances are a problem, which is also a narrative that I want to challenge. But within this narrative, we didn't see anyone paying attention to the intersection of renewable ordinances and justice and equity. So that's the relationship that we brought into focus, but we didn't hypothesize the reasons why.
In terms of this point that you raise around the perceived difficulties or downsides of ordinances, what did you see when you updated your research recently? Was there any change, anything more that you discovered?
We saw that the trend that we had identified, the anecdotal evidence that we have been seeing in the newspapers, for example, between 2023 and 2026, is actually real. We saw an increase of roughly 20 to 25% in the number of counties with restrictive ordinances for clean energy development. And we believe that this is a response to the main pieces of legislation from the Biden administration, that is the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which created incentives to build more clean energy. This naturally creates a backlash because there are communities that don't want to see this happen, because in many cases, and there was a very interesting paper that I think it was a National Renewable Energy Laboratory, former National Renewable Energy Laboratory, put out that they surveyed developers and the way that developers approach communities can be improved massively. So that creates also incentives for communities to oppose these developments. So that's one part of why we have seen such a remarkable increase in the number of counties. The other one is basically the other side of the coin to all of this, which is represented by the Trump administration, is that the Trump administration has created the conditions to really turbocharge any sort of opposition to renewable energies, because they have legitimized that fight in a way that we have not seen before, at least in recent memory, not even during the first Trump administration.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of attention around this notion of abundance advanced by Ezra Klein from the New York Times. And so, just recognizing that I think for a long time, there's been this, I think, concerted effort to say regulations undermine economic opportunity and prosperity, policies are too restrictive for business and corporate profits, and that by and large, the way that we approach policy has been problematic. So first, let's talk a little bit about, from your perspective, given the amount of time you've studied this, I mean, what is problematic about this perspective, or what do you think is untrue about this perspective?
This is a big topic.
Definitely.
Of course. I think the main policy argument of abundance, basically, the way you state it, is the excessive red tape, right? From federal environmental statutes to local zoning. All of this is driving up the cost and slowing down the building of the things we really and desperately need because we face enormous problems. And although it is true that we need to build more infrastructure, we need to build infrastructure the right way. And I think where this focus on abundance, which is framed as a supply problem, I think one of the most important failures of this framing is that they fail to engage, and this will sound a little bit abstract, but I will bring it down in a minute. I will bring it down to earth in a minute. I think one of the main problems is that they fail to engage with issues of power disparities in our society. And this failure is especially shocking given that wealth inequality is at an unprecedented level in our society. A growing number of commercial and industrial sectors are defined by extreme levels of market concentration. And the interactions of these economic conditions with our governing institutions really do threaten the viability of our economic system and constitutional democracy. So under these circumstances, it's impossible to credibly consider any policy rooted in abundance, framed as the problem is regulations, without accounting for the causes and consequences of power disparities that are at the heart of the policy outcomes that we see. I think the most clear example that we can think of is the case of Doge and Elon Musk. Obviously, Musk has embraced the ethos of deregulation and growth and innovation via deregulation, and it has evolved or devolved, depending how you want to see it, into this obsession with deconstructing and destroying the state.
And as you said, I think we could do a whole podcast on this, and I can think of a number of my colleagues that would be lining up to be guests on this show to be able to argue against this perspective. And I think a lot of our listeners would understand that, there are definitely broad merits of when we have strong law and policy that protect the public interest from all sorts of things and advance our abilities to be able to have a more inclusive and free democracy. So yes, another show for sure. I want to make sure we get into your research and all the work because it's so rich and there's so much there. So what you were saying is that the way in which policies are developed are fundamentally flawed, right? The way that what you're seeing in your research, given this mismatch between, or rather this alignment between communities that are economically challenged and the restrictions that are in place for them to be able to take advantage of the clean energy transition and the resources that are there. So what is the ideal situation? So if we really wanted to build a democracy and subsequently laws that people felt good about and didn't really sort of get behind laws that in many regards we would argue undermine their opportunity. What are your recommendations?
So I think we need to rethink the way we envision, and again, this will be very abstract and I will bring it down to earth later, but I think we do need to rethink the way we conceptualize the role of the administrative state. And that is something that my colleagues here at CPR, and particularly James Goodwin, our policy director, is very vocal about. We need to have a more assertive and democratic rulemaking process. We need to have a people-centered, power-conscious rulemaking process that uses deliberate stakeholder engagement strategies and that produces faster and better results because of the stakeholder engagement strategies and equitable participation strategies, not in spite of. So this means that there must be sufficiently available factual information for all parties involved. That means closing the information gap between governments, developers, and communities. That is key. There has to be a process that is procedurally just, in which people can participate if they want to participate. And there has to be this public participation in policy processes must be non-performative, and it should ensure legitimacy through reciprocity. So governments need to show the public how their input actually shapes policy choices. So these are basic building blocks on how to do policymaking better. So at the local level, for example, if a community is considering renewable ordinance that will regulate the deployment of utility scale solar, community engagement and public participation must happen before the ordinance is written. This sounds obvious, but it's not always the case. They need to have information and tools and capacity to really understand what are the implications of the different provisions that actually go into a renewable ordinance. And they need to be able to trust that there is some good faith happening on the other side. And that is both at the developers level, but also at the government or decision-making power level. So this is what would ensure a better decision-making process, because it's understandable, right? If communities see that there is a developer that is coming to build a utility-scale solar site that is 1,000 acres, right, without any sort of engagement, without any sort of information before the sites are chosen, before the permits are requested, the blowback is understandable, right? So before all that happens, there has to be sufficient communication, sufficient engagement, and also I would be willing to say too, some sort of guarantee that the community will receive something in return for coexisting with something that in many cases is perceived as a cost. It may not be financial, but there are many types of different things that we may consider as negative externalities, right? So we need to find a way to compensate those communities. So that was a long answer to your question. But I think if we can put those building blocks in place, we can end up with better ordinances, better regulations, and a more equitable process, which I think it would be really, really helpful for everyone.
So, Fede, the list that you offered, I think, is so helpful for advocates and people out there who may be working on these issues in terms of what specific things they could and should be asking for in terms of a model process. I think the question that crosses my mind is for those communities that are more affluent, where you are seeing fewer barriers, are you able to suggest that there's a different process happening there that might be the reason for those differences? And then I would speculate why you would see differences. Or is this really a conversation about poor communities, because that tends to be where we place a lot of the energy infrastructure?
So we didn't really tease out any sort of explanation, and our conclusions were not that there are more restrictions in lower income communities or disadvantaged communities. We just wanted to show that there are many more of those at the intersection that we sometimes want to acknowledge. We had another hypothesis that had to do with the overlap between communities that had historically depended on fossil fuel, that were really engaged with the fossil fuel economy. We wanted to see if those were more anti-renewable in terms of the ordinances that they had, and that didn't hold. So why some communities decide to restrict more than others, I think it's a complex question that I don't have a definitive answer for. I think, and smarter people than me have studied this extensively, right? But it's a combination of the political conditions, previous history with development, current economic activities, density, and then other things that are a little bit less intuitive but have a massive impact in terms of how restrictive ordinances are, which are, for example, the average parcel size in a given county. And this is really interesting. Some folks from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I think, wrote a paper on this, showing that the average parcel size in a county is the strongest explanatory factor to understand how restrictive ordinances are, because if you think about how local ordinances are written, when you define setbacks from different elements in the landscape, you write an ordinance saying that, for example, a wind turbine must be located 1.5 times the height of the turbine from a property line, right? So you use the property line as the anchor and you draw your distance from it. The smaller the parcel size in a given county, the more property lines you have, because the more individual properties you have, right? So that distance from the property line becomes a huge driver of how restrictive ordinances are. So I don't have a final answer to say why some counties have more restrictive ordinances than others, because the explanation is probably multi-causal. There are also other less transparent reasons, like misinformation campaigns, coordinated misinformation campaigns that are happening all the time. This happens, for example, with offshore wind. This happens all the time. In the Midwest, we saw a big coordinated anti-renewable campaign happening in Michigan, where there was one individual that was coordinating a group that was very effective at coordinating opposition. And then we have other mechanisms that have to do with much more mundane dynamics, like county officials not knowing where to start. So they have basically a list of people they trust, and they go to those people. So you see, for example, the same consultant writing ordinances for 10 or 12 counties that are basically copy-paste of the same model, which doesn't respect the local conditions.
Just a point of clarification on the Wisconsin paper, the smaller property size is related to more restrictive policy, or the larger property size?
The smaller property size is associated with more restrictive policies, because smaller size parcels means more property lines, which means more excluded land when the property line is used as the anchor for the setback.
Got it. You noted this reality of sort of what we think of as cookie cutter ordinances. You're seeing some trend of similar policies happening in multiple places. And I think, we could easily speculate that there is a motivation for certain actors to restrict clean energy. We might think of the fossil fuel industry that obviously has a lot to lose with the abundance of energy sources that they cannot control and own in the same way. I mean, do you see it getting worse? Do you think that there is a concerted effort out there to really restrict all this development?
There is definitely a concerted effort in some cases. We cannot say that behind every restrictive ordinance. And I want to caveat with this. Ordinances are not a problem, right? This is something that we really struggled with when we were writing our big report in 2023. And I say we struggled because we wanted to communicate the fact that ordinances that regulate development are not a problem per se. We need regulations. Regulations make everything possible. Otherwise, everything would be anarchy. We need regulations. And as long as those regulations are built on proper democratic participation and factual information, then if a community decides, look, we don't want renewable energy, that's fine. That's the democratic process, and that's perfectly fine. The problem is when these tenets are not in place, when these conditions are not in place. And that is something that we saw over and over again. So in some cases, there is a concerted effort that could be pro-fossil fuel or anti-renewable energy, one or the other. We saw that happening. What we saw most often is that local councils feel the pressure to respond to some form of demand from their constituencies. That could be to regulate or to restrict, and that these local council members, these local bodies lack the sophistication, the capacity, the knowledge, and the information to regulate in a way that makes sense given their local conditions. So when faced with this situation, they need to fill the information void somehow. In many cases, that is via misinformation. In some cases, it's merely via trusted voices. That is, for example, council members in a neighboring county that have put regulations in place recently, and they just adopt those as is without really going through the process of tailoring them to their local conditions.
One of the things I wanted to do for our listeners who've listened to other episodes is to try to pull in some of the other shows that we've had just to ask you some more questions, Fede. So one that comes to mind is we just did an episode with John Farrell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We did a show about utilities being villains. I mean, I know it's easy to paint all of this as being coordinated by the fossil fuel industry, but do you also see some role or stake by utilities as well to be bad actors?
Absolutely. Not so much that in some cases I do. It depends of the state market structure. So I think each state is almost its own universe. But I think where you do see the impact of utilities is when you need to think about building transmission. That's where utilities shine, and not in a good way, because the incentives are not there. The incentives are to monopolize and keep the status quo in place, and that's it. So there's definitely a place for utilities to play, and that they play really well.
My other question is, Fede, when you looked at the research, I don't know if you looked this closely, but do you find that when you look at the places that have more restrictive ordinances, that there's a lower level of participation in the process as well? I'm wondering if, because part of what you're suggesting is that there needs to be a process that has, more transparency, more engagement, more education. So when you looked at your areas, did you go to the point in looking at participation levels? Was it, people didn't kind of show up for things, didn't write comments, or is it just generally the socioeconomic conditions and the level of restrictive ordinances?
We did not go into the details of understanding how the participation at the local level correlated with the level of restrictions that we saw, because we didn't have the time or the funding to do so, but also because finding information at the local level is conditional on the counties keeping records of all the minutes and the meetings and keeping well-kept records of everything that happened. Some counties do this really well. Some counties don't. And this creates a problem if you want to generalize from your conclusions, because you are only capturing a subset of the population. It's the population that keeps the best records. And it would not be surprising if those counties are also the ones that have the most tools to enable participation in place. So we would be biasing any sort of conclusion. So it's a bit difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we started the show by you talking about, interdisciplinary approaches and the challenges of getting at very complex issues. The reason why I asked that, Fede, is that, we had a show with Anika Goss-Foster from Detroit, Michigan, about the solar placement in the city of Detroit. The city was putting solar panels in residential lots. So if anyone's ever been to Detroit, right there's just a lot of challenges. There are houses, and then there may be an empty lot. They were putting solar panels in those empty lots. It was causing more heat for the neighborhood. It was causing more flooding because of the water coming off the panels. And I think the kicker was that, and quite shocking, was that the community that was hosting those sites didn't benefit from the energy created by them. And so,
Right.
It's kind of, to me, an example of just a real unfortunate decision and approach. And the community's housing price or value is going down as a result, right? Because it's kind of an odd neighborhood that I can imagine you live in. So I guess the question I have, and, again, the complexity of it is that I think can be a lot of reasons why people do oppose these investments. I think that by and large, right now I live in a rural community in New England, and I think there are a lot of communities that are fighting solar and wind because it, is seen as at odds with interests of the beauty of their community or available farmland. There's, I think there's a myriad of reasons, and I think your point is still well taken, which is we have to embark in a very active discussion in communities, have everyone involved, talk through it, figure out what works, look at the benefits, look at the challenges, all of the things that you're saying. But yeah, for me, I kind of wonder to the extent that, people are really engaged and there is a lot of concern about, the impacts, implications, the benefits of all of this. So it reinforces what you're saying, but I think it also reinforces for us as advocates, people who are trying to advance clean energy solutions, that, often we are not, I wouldn't say that for EJ folks and people working community, but I think the kind of mainstream climate movement actors are not always the best at kind of thinking through these questions either to facilitate more comfort and clarity and building of things that, kind of blend, community interests and, of course, broader climate interests. So, I think it is such a complicated dynamic. And I think that anything that seems mysterious and new can be alarming. And we're seeing that right through all the outcry and organic organizing that's happening around data centers, which I think similarly are, sort of these technological advances that people are not quite sure, is this going to be good for me or bad for me? We've got to be able to do this work better. And I say we, right? It's not just the industry that is, advancing clean energy or, sort of muting the opponents who are doing it to just hamstring us longer around fossil fuels. But I think, it's just a really complicated, situation for sure.
I think so. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of the opposition that emerges from local communities is driven by misinformation. It's driven by practices that are extractive in nature and just reproduce patterns of economic activity that I would like to see not happen anymore. And I do agree that we need to build a lot more. There are many arguments from those who don't want to see any more clean energy that are easily disproved. And in many cases, even though they are easily disproved by facts, that doesn't change the course of how these things are written, because it doesn't come down to information anymore. It doesn't come down to facts anymore. And I think that is part of the greater environment that we are living in. So
Yeah,
if that's
definitely
the case, then if we cannot change things at that stage, then we need to change the process of building trust, the process of engaging earlier, and the process of showing benefits, and not benefits for the faraway metropolis that will receive the clean energy, but benefits for those who are coexisting with those developments day in and day out. And I think that's a gap that we still need to find a way to bridge. And there are many, many organizations that are working on it. And they are doing amazing work creating multi-level coalitions to make sure that these things happen. And they partner with interested landowners that are also, bringing the individual rights part of this. Like, if I have land and I want to build solar, why can't I just do it? It is safe. It's not going to burst into flames. It's safe. So why not? Right? So they are building these multi-level coalitions that are, I think, promising, at least when it comes to thinking how to solve the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's so many community leaders and community organizations that are leading the way and trying to really bring us back together. It's really, as you noted, a time of division. And really what we need to be doing is winning hearts and minds, and especially recognizing people's pocketbook challenges, which are growing every day. For our listeners who work in state capitals, Fede, what are you seeing at that level? What role does the state play around all this?
Whenever we think about local ordinances and how they will affect the build out of clean energy resources, we need to analyze that in tandem with the state laws or state level legislation. So the current landscape is basically a combination of geography, renewable potential, past history of renewable development, political conditions. When it comes to building more renewable generation, we are seeing some trends, like three basic trends, I would say. One of them is state level preemption and streamlining permitting. So some states, for example, are stepping in to address siting challenges through preemption. That is when the state law preempts local governments from restricting clean energy development. This is usually paired with expedited permitting processes and creating uniform state standards. So Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota have taken this road. So the preemption of local authority limits local government's ability to ban or to unreasonably restrict clean energy developments. And this process involves establishing statewide standards for setbacks, noise, heights, etc. There are risks, though. So when we think about state preemption, this can actually undermine local government efforts to shape their own communities, right? Or reduce or eliminate opportunities for meaningful community engagement in the siting process. So this creates a tension, right, on the level that is making decisions, and it's a democratic tension that needs to be resolved. But there are some states that are following this pathway. A second pathway is basically based on the supply side of this, and that is by state assistance or incentives to building clean energy at the local level. So some governments can design effective rules that come paired with different tax incentives or other forms of assistance that will boost the development of clean energy resources. And the third, and these are not mutually exclusive, of course, but the third has to do with community benefits frameworks to address local opposition and to ensure that some of those benefits are going directly to the communities. So unlocking faster clean energy development this will mean getting nearby communities on board if you want to avoid challenges and litigation and opposition. So one way to fixing this is by using community benefits frameworks, which is what the Department of Energy, for example, during the Biden administration did. And we have an upcoming webinar next month on this very topic. And using community benefits frameworks can minimize projects' risks, can overcome opposition, can ensure that communities do benefit from new energy infrastructure. And it is a way to gain social acceptance or social license for renewable projects. So those are three of the big trends that we see.
But I want to make sure that, our listeners know that you've created this amazing interactive online tool that's available to them to learn more about their local community. Tell us more about the resources that are available.
When we did our research, we decided that we wanted to make the information as open and as transparent as possible, because it's not easy to find access to the actual text of the ordinances for those who are interested, for advocates, for community members. So we wanted to centralize all that information and include the other things that we added to our analysis. So we created this tool that has basically 3 maps that combines solar, wind, and all these other variables that are related to justice and equity and energy burden. And this allows folks to search for their zip code, for their county name, or just zoom in, zoom out, and click on individual counties and see how many wind ordinances there are, how many projects have been contested, and critically, to be able to access the ordinances themselves. So folks will see a hyperlink that will lead them to their county ordinance. It's a good resource. It's useful. I think it's a very intuitive way to understand the extent of the current landscape and to have information that is easily accessible. Building this meant hand coding hundreds and hundreds of ordinances, extracting, the setbacks and the height limits and the sound limits and all of that. So it's a resource that has a lot of information, and hopefully folks will find it useful. And we are now working on other tools. We're working on tools that would hopefully allow people to play around with different parameters to see how much land is being restricted and to understand how to craft better ordinances that are informed by information, by the local conditions, by the different landscapes and zoning areas of their counties, to see what an ordinance could look like eventually. And if they are challenging current ordinances, to see how to improve them. That's the dream scenario for us. And hopefully we'll be able to create those tools for folks.
Well, thank you, Fede, for bringing together all that important information about local ordinances, for the research that you're doing, for the recommendations that you're advancing and making that available to our listeners and to advocates and organizers. We will add to our show notes a link to all of that, to the Center for Progressive Reform's Communities Left Behind project that we talked about today. I'm going to have a link to the interactive online tool and also other information, and as well as Center for Progressive Reform's website, so you can sign up and check out their webinars.
Thank you so much. This has been very fun. I hope that this is useful, and I hope that people find some joy in listening to all of this.
Thank you, Fede, for being with us today, and thanks for you, our listeners, for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our recording engineer, Angel Bautista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts and consider supporting us with a donation. If you'd like to do that or want to learn more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Bluesky, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we're driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.